The Olivet Discourse is one of the most important passages in the New Testament. Here, Jesus on the Mount of Olives looks upon the great temple of Jerusalem and tells his apostles that this temple will be destroyed. So Jesus accurately predicts the destruction of the temple. Now, Jesus spoke these words in about 30 AD, and the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So if this is true, it is a remarkable prediction. So let's analyze this passage. The Olivet Discourse is recorded in both the Gospel of Mark and Matthew. Now remember, Mark was written first, and then Matthew writes next and uses Mark as a source. So Matthew is copying from Mark. For example, in Mark's account, we read, quote, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down." And then Matthew nearly exactly copies this over into his own gospel, quote, "You see all of these, do you not? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down." End quote. Jesus then says, soon after the destruction of the temple, he will return back to earth. This is of course known as the second coming of Christ. So first the temple will be destroyed, and then the second coming. Mark says, quote, "But in those days, after that suffering, then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather the elect from the four winds, from the ends of earth to the ends of heaven." End quote. Now, when Matthew is copying this over, he makes one slight change, quote, "immediately after the suffering of those days." So as you can see, Mark says in those days, but Matthew changes this to immediately. So what does this mean? Well, Mark thinks that soon after the destruction of the temple, in those days Jesus will return. Maybe months, maybe years, but in those days. Mark isn't specific. Matthew doesn't like that. So he instead says no, immediately after the destruction of the temple, then Jesus will return. Commenting on this, one scholar writes, quote, "By adding immediately in verse 29, Matthew has significantly heightened the already dramatic connection in Mark between the section alluding to the destruction of the temple and the parousia, the second coming." Another commentator writes, quote, "Matthew expects the parousia within the space of at most one lifetime. This fits well with the immediately of verse 29. So it's clear that Matthew expects the second coming immediately after the destruction of the temple. And this is actually clear from the very start of his story. When the disciples initially asked Jesus about when the temple will be destroyed, the disciples say the following in Mark, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" In contrast, in Matthew, the disciples say, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So from the very beginning of Matthew's account, it's clear that the destruction of the temple is closely tied with Jesus' second coming and the end of the world. Now, even if we ignore this word immediately, it's still undeniable that both Mark and Matthew think that the destruction of the temple and the second coming are connected, as they both say, quote, "I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So at most, the time between the destruction of the temple and Jesus' return is one lifetime. One of the very first New Testament historians, David Strauss, writes the following, quote, "Thus it is impossible to evade the acknowledgement that in this discourse, if we do not mutilate it to suit our own views, Jesus at first speaks of the destruction of the temple, and then farther on until the close of his return at the end of all things, and that he places the two events in immediate connection." End quote. Now, returning back to Matthew's use of the word immediately, this also really helps us in dating the Gospel of Matthew, so figuring out when Matthew was written. One author notes, quote, "Thus, when Matthew inserted the word immediately, he showed that he thought the parousia and the end of the age would follow immediately upon the destruction of Jerusalem. He would never have made this insertion if he were writing 10 or 30 years after the fall of the city." End quote. So what does that mean? It means that Matthew must have been written no later than 70 AD. Now, if you pick up most commentaries on Matthew, they tend to date Matthew in about 80 AD. But how on earth could Matthew say Jesus will return immediately after the destruction of the temple if he was writing 10 years after 70 AD? That makes no sense at all. So at the latest, Matthew must have been written at 70 AD. Perhaps he witnessed the destruction and said Jesus is going to be coming back any day now. And this, of course, also means that Mark must have been written before this, so maybe around 60 AD. Again, another scholar writes, quote, "Matthew's redactional insertion of immediately in verse 29, he means that immediately after the destruction and desecration of the temple, the parousia is to be expected. This, as we have argued, is only conceivable if the evangelist writes before and not after 70 AD. Now, this scholar thinks Matthew was written before 70 AD, which might be true. It would mean we need to push back both Mark and Matthew here a little bit. But I personally feel Matthew was written exactly on 70 AD. And that's because Matthew seems to be aware of the destruction of the temple, so must have been written in 70 AD or just a bit later. Let me give you a few examples of Matthew seemingly knowing about the destruction of the temple. For example, when Jesus is cleansing the temple, which is found in Mark 11 and Matthew 21, in Mark we read, "He was teaching and saying, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you've made it a den of robbers.'" Now, when Matthew is copying this over into his gospel, he omits the reference to the temple being a house of prayer for all the nations. And many will argue, and I agree with them, that Matthew omits this because he knows the temple can't function as a house of prayer for all the nations because it's already been destroyed. Another example is in the parable of the great banquet. When the original guests refused to come to the banquet, we're told that the king burnt their city, which is a very specific judgment, and this is also what the Romans did in 70 AD. Lastly, when Jesus is rebuking the Jewish leaders in chapter 23 and tells them they will be judged for their sins, he says, quote, "Truly I tell you, all of this will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I've desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" End quote. Again, this sounds like what happened in 70 AD. So I would argue that Matthew is written exactly on 70 AD because he seems to be aware that the temple is destroyed. So hopefully that helps you in understanding when the Gospels were written. Now, returning back to our original point, it's clear that Matthew added to Mark to highlight the imminent return of Christ. And in this entire series, I've argued that since Matthew believes that Christ will return at any moment, he feels justified to add in unhistorical events into his story in order to convert as many Jews as possible. What do you think about this theory? Let me know in the comments below. And before we end, a quick question to you, my audience. If you've enjoyed this series about how Matthew changed Mark, would you be interested in a series about how Luke changed Matthew? There is so much to analyze there. For example, how Luke is clearly written after the destruction of the temple, because he's aware that Jesus didn't immediately return, and therefore he inserts the time of the Gentiles between these two events in order to separate them. There's so much interesting material in Luke like that. So if you'd like a series showing how Luke changed Matthew, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. If we get enough likes, I'll know there's an appetite for more of this content. And lastly, if you are in a position to give, please consider throwing just a few bucks my way on Patreon. This channel only exists thanks to their generosity. Thanks for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one.